check one.
United Church of Christ, Sacred Conversation on Race and Privilege. This is the last of 5 sessions discussing the book How to Be an Anti-Racist by Dr. Ibram Kendi. Our first 2 weeks before the book were interviews, and next week, our last of the 8-week series will again be an interview, and we'll say a little more about that at the end. But tonight we will be discussing chapters 16, 17, and 18 and the conclusion of the book. And I am starting off with chapter 16, which is entitled, interestingly, Failure. I don't know how often I have seen that as the title of a chapter. But Kendi talks about how failed racist ideologies have led to the failure of anti-racism efforts to make a difference and to really overcome the racism that is so prevalent. And one of the things that he talks about is an approach to defeating racism that he calls Uplift Suasion. And I will tell you, quite honestly, that that's an entirely new term for me. And he talked about suasion over and over again, and I kept wanting it to be persuasion, but he uses the term Uplift Suasion. And he explained that in the beginning by talking about the paternalism of the early abolitionists who expected that if individual blacks were perfect, then they would just persuade away white racism. Although that approach failed to stop the growth of slavery, Kendi tells us that it continues today in the pressure that he and others, and he talks a lot about his own experience, says that he felt to always act in an upstanding way to persuade away white racism. My heart really ached at the pain in his words in this chapter. Just to share a few, he said, "I felt the burden my whole black life to be perfect before both white people and the black people judging whether I am representing the race well. The judges never let me be myself, be my imperfect self." According to Kendi, this moral and educational suasion approach is based on the assumption that we just have to change people's minds about black people before we can change racist policies. So I think there are two aspects of these questions, and I'm going to separate them. First, how did you respond to his experience about talking about that burden on his back of always feeling like he needed to be perfect?
Yeah, there were two immediate reactions I had while listening to him talk about that. The first was I hearkened back to the second week of conversation with my friend Justin, and how Justin almost reflected that same feeling. And I was thinking back about my friend Justin's story about in being a senior in high school and being told by his the woman that he asked to prom that her parents wouldn't let her go to prom with him because he's black, and how not only painful that was, but I just remember specifically Justin saying, no matter what I accomplished, how good of a student I am, what I had done, that I wasn't good enough. And I just remember thinking, what a powerful response that is, and so how that just continues, to this day. And then, as I said to Justin that night, and again, what I was thinking about is how in the gay and lesbian community there is this internalized homophobia that is often dealt with, where people feel like if they just achieve enough, then they'll get acceptance. And so, again, the parallel there I was struck by. Mm-hmm. But it's heartbreaking to hear him talk about it.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that it's first of all, it's not an uncommon thing for people to feel that they have to live up to standards. Yeah. And so I remember as children, what we heard from our parents, don't embarrass the family, conduct yourself with honor, and that kind of thing at school and in sports and things like that. So there's that layer of pressure for all of us that comes from our families and our churches and our, when you're a Christian, it's like, if you behave that way, you can't be a Christian,
Right, yeah.
Or so, but what's heartbreaking is that on top of all of that comes the need to prove yourself because of your skin color. Yeah. And that's overwhelming. Yeah. So.
As I thought about it, I felt sad, and then I also felt really angry because it just seems so unfair. And he talks about, this assumption, that racism and racist ideas are just wrong thinking. They're just ignorance and hate. And if well-behaved, successful blacks will overcome that, and it just isn't true, and we know it isn't true, and we know it hasn't worked.
And also as if it's on the in the responsibility of black people to fight the racism of others.
Right.
It's as if it's their responsibility to fix it.
Right.
That was another thing that kind of struck me about that, but yeah.
Well, and it made me think, in terms of my own self-examination, are there any ways that I have unwillingly or unwittingly held people to expectations that were a burden for them, and contributed to their feeling that they just can't be themselves because they've got to act in a certain way, and that gives me pause to think about. The second question that's related, because he says, it's just this idea that we just have to change people's ideas about black people, and he says, in the changing minds and changing policies, there's a school that says you have to change people's minds before you can change policies. And he says, nope, you've got to change the policies. And once people have to act differently, then they begin to see and think differently. Where do you fall on do you change minds or change policies first question?
For me, this all brought to mind a book we probably all read back in the day by Saul Alinsky called Rules for Radicals. I don't know if you remember that book. He was a community organizer in Chicago. And his little book was one that we were required to read back in college when I was taking sociology and that kind of thing. And really, in between for me, recalling what he said, in between the changing of the mind and in changing the policy becomes the changing of the power equation. Because you're not going to change people's minds right off the bat. Policy doesn't get changed until it goes through a system of change. So somehow the power equation in between that has to change. And that comes from making it beneficial for the oppressor to change their behavior because of power that's exerted. So that's what it brought to mind for me.
Yeah, this felt like the proverbial like chicken egg question, because I really can make an argument for both. I mean, I really struggle to come out on one side or the other. I feel like in the era and the time in which we're living, it really does feel that the policies and the structures have to change before much else does. I mean, it just feels like we're in a time in which people have to be told this is how it's going to be, and I just feel like that's kind of where our society is. And I'm not sure that's good, bad, or indifferent. I just feel like that's kind of where people have been brought to, is that there has to be this kind of legislative way of being, of things being handled.
Yeah, it's a difficult thing in a democratic, supposedly democratic society, which is partly democratic but partly ruled by wealth, and I'm trying to remember the word for that. Plutocratic. Mm-hmm. To legislate enough change so that something good happens is very difficult without it becoming almost autocratic. Mm-hmm. We were just talking about that today in the men's new chapters group when we were talking about climate change, mm-hmm. and what it's going to take for our society as a whole to change the policies. Here's one policy. We all can buy a car, and we can drive a car, and we can spew out carbon emissions. That's the freedom we have. Who's going to say, no, you can't drive a car? Mm-hmm. I mean, that's just, so it's a difficult thing.
Right, and one of the things that drives change in a true democracy is the will of the people. And so if there are changed minds and changed hearts, the way a democracy is created to work is that they apply pressure, be it through contacting their representatives or through the election process. They instill change. So how does that, process work? How do we get those legislative changes? Well, the people initiate the change. So, it's changed hearts, not necessarily changed policies, but I just am convinced. I mean, the thing that keeps coming to my mind, and I'm not trying to over-politicize it, but I'm thinking about the mask debate that our society is having, and the thing that it seems to take to compel some people to wear masks. And I know that all three of us have our masks right here in the chairs. As soon as we're off air, we put our masks on. Is that the thing that compels people to wear masks is that local governments, and in some states, state governments, have said you have to wear masks. And yet, here locally in Collier County, the thing that has, I believe, gotten a mask ordinance done is that there has been pressure put on civic leaders to make that happen. And so, I don't know, I mean, again, it's that chicken egg type mindset.
Well, I have long described myself as a both-and person.
Yes.
So I can't, especially if you put in the word wait, I don't think you can not do both. Because you can't wait till the policies have changed
Right.
to start changing minds, but you can't wait till all the minds got changed before you can start changing policies. So I think it is both and. The next thing that he says, which I think is interesting and becomes more challenging, is he talks about an activist is a person who has a record of producing power or policy change. So there's your power middle, David. But in other words, he's focusing on outcomes, not just intent or actions taken, and suggests that we tend to do things that make us feel good, like we did something good, and don't always worry about did we get the desired results. So he asked the question, what if instead of feeling advocacy, that we advocate in ways that make us feel good, we had outcome advocacy and measured the radicalism of speech by how radically it transforms open-minded people and liberates the anti-racist power within them. So if we focus on outcomes and results, what does that mean, and what would it mean for us if we're going to talk about next steps?
I was intrigued by this part of this chapter because, so the wordsmith in me and the wannabe poet loved how Kendi writes and eloquently describes this. And then the practical, the pragmatist in me kept thinking, how do you gauge this? Because I think especially something as big as and overwhelming as racism, I mean, to me, that is one of these, we move the dial. And, I'll talk about it in the last chapter, but I've been really moved by the death of John Lewis in the last week since we were last together, and to hear some of the commentators talk about, what was it like in '65 when, Bloody Sunday and he walked across the Pettus Bridge and things like this. But yet we've not reaffirmed the Voting Rights Act and how he tried to get that to happen, and so how do you measure that? So I frankly, in typical fashion, I got caught up in the weeds of it, the details, trying to figure out what that would look like and what that would feel like.
Yeah. I think, like you, I recognize the power of his words, but I think he also recognized in this chapter, calling it failure, that
touche.
he saw in his own teaching with his own students and his lack of ability to organize them to do the protests for the Louisiana group.
Right.
He felt the failure of that. And I think he recognized how difficult it is to move from the feeling advocacy to outcome advocacy.
Because he really writes that off as a complete failure.
Right.
I mean, at the beginning of
right.
Yeah.
So as far as, as I think about it, like, where do you start? Well, I think you have to identify what exactly is it that you want to change, and then what are the steps that are going to have to happen in order to make that happen? What are the outcomes we're looking for, and to be very specific, because it's again it's so easy to get overwhelmed by the immensity of the elephant when all you need to do is take a bite.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I had a colleague in Dallas who used to say, if we were facing some enormous task at my previous church, and she would say, well, how do you eat an elephant? Well, one bite at a time, and so I do think the enormity of something like racism, you think to yourself, well, we can't solve it. And we've talked about it on this team. How do four white clergy in a predominantly white congregation, overwhelmingly white congregation, how do we address racism? Well, we start, we do something.
Identify a problem.
Identify a problem.
So in November, we have an election coming up, all right? If we look at Collier County, and even not entirely the county, but even if we just look at Naples, can we identify that voting is, there's an equity across the board, and that all segments of this community are going to have access?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, was access to voting, right?
Yeah.
You just start there.
That's one possible identification.
Right.
Well, and I was going in the same direction, David, that for me the challenge becomes, and I don't have an answer, but what are the racist policies? Maybe related to voting, maybe related to income or housing, or I don't know. But what are the racist policies that we name as racist because, by his definition, they create inequities?
Right.
That we could identify here in Collier County, and then what could we do to make a real difference to change policy? And I agree, you have to get specific. I know that I need time, a lot of reflection, and help from others to begin to pick up a challenge like that.
And I also think, speaking locally, I think it's easy, I'll use an I statement, I think it's easy for me to think that all inequality in Collier County is based in Immokalee. There is tremendous inequality in Immokalee. I'm not denying that. But there is also inequality right here in this part of Collier County as well that cannot be overlooked. So it is the both and. There must be tremendous impact made in Immokalee, but there must also be impact made here in this part of Collier County as well. And so again, I think to not just say, we have to make an impact in Immokalee, which we do, but there also are inequities that must be looked at and examined here as well.
I had not planned to say this, but this just brings to mind a wonderful story a church member shared with me in her small condominium development. They had the same person clean, I don't know how much the outsides, I don't think it was much inside, but clean for years and years and years. And the church member asked what her salary was. Mm-hmm. And when she found out, she was appalled and rallied the condominium owners to make a significant difference for that one person, mm-hmm. but to address the incredible inequity of what that person was making. So there are little things that we could be done. But I get to turn it over to chapter 17, David.
Oh, you're already done. Okay, well.
Already done. Next.
All right. Well, so if 16 is labeled failure, 17 is labeled success.
Ta-da.
That's a happier title.
It's a happier title, right? So let's take a look at that, if I can get to the right page here. All right, there we go. And when I saw the title of this, I was thinking to myself, he's going to talk about all of the successes that he's experienced as a anti-racist advocate, and it became very clear that was not
where this is headed.
It was not there. No, and I want to just start with, he's going to start with talking about his experience with a lecturer by the name of Boyce Watkins, who's talking about racism as a disease and how he likes words and phrases as much as anybody else. So he's going to challenge him and say, man, I don't know about that. I think maybe it's really an organ essential for America to function, and if we took that organ out, America would collapse, But then he moved on. On page 218, he talks about success as the dark road we fear, where anti-racist power and policy predominate. He goes on to say, the story of our generation will be based on what we are willing to do. So that brings up a kind of a philosophical, hypothetical question, and that is, why would we be afraid, or what is there to be fearful about a society where anti-racist policy and power predominate, where things are equitable? Why should we be afraid of that?
Why should we, or why are we?
Or why are we, I think he's asking, why are we afraid of being successful in moving towards that?
Because the reason I was asking and I know it's in front of me, but I wanted to get a sense of where you were headed with this, because I believe what stops us, or what makes us afraid of it, is that it challenges those of us with power. And it's not even that it challenges us as individuals, it challenges the system by which our power is protected. And with power, in my opinion, comes privilege. And I don't know that I'm even aware often, especially before doing this intentional work through this reading and through our conversations in other ways, I'm not even sure I'm aware of how much privilege I really have, and how much it can be, quote, threatened or changed or whatever by policies being changed or moving forward. But all of a sudden you see that it can be different. It doesn't even necessarily mean there's less power there or less privilege. It just means it's different, or it's more equitably shared. But it means it's different. And as I'm fond of saying, the only being in the world that likes change is a wet baby. And so it's change, it's a threat to privilege, and so I think it's all those things.
Well, and I would add, what came to my mind is, were we to really achieve that, we're talking about a new world order.
Well, yeah.
And
that's biblical.
I got more biblical
Yeah,
stuff. But that we live in a culture that's marked by racism, that we know it's in the air. It permeates our lives. And I would say that either it's growing, or at the very least, there is a growing acceptance of it in overt and verbalized ways, so that to talk about anti-racist policy and power being predominant really is to change the whole way that we live together.
Yeah, it's
and
changing upside down.
I really did. I don't always do this, but I found myself getting biblical and thinking about the image. Traditionally, the kingdom of God, talk about the reign of God, the realm of God, that we talk about it. It's not here fully, but there are glimpses that it has come into the world in some way, and I would like, because I need hope, to feel like we could say that about anti-racism, that we're far from the fullness of it, but that there are glimpses, and to hold on to that, because we are talking about living in a really different way, and that is change.
Well, I was thinking about, David's the one with the biblical grounding, but when she talked about the New World Order, I was thinking about John's Revelation, where there's this image of, Jesus' return, and it's this, I saw a new heaven and a new earth, and so I think about this idea of a new earth, and it is this upside down where there is equity and equality, true equality among all people, and so that's kind of what made me say, well, that's biblical, because it would be a new world order.
Yeah, I see it not just in Revelation, I see it in the Beatitudes.
Well, yeah.
And the Sermon on the Mount.
I was going to say Sermon on the Mount, Sermon on the Hill, all,
Sure.
yeah.
Yeah. Matthew 25, sheep and the goats.
Yeah.
So lots of examples there. So I was intrigued by his discussion about when he he talks about grad school, his first perspective on racism that he got from a book by Toure and Hamilton entitled Black Power, The Politics of Liberation in America. And in this book, the authors identify racism as both overt and covert, as individual and institutional. And Kendi suggests that that racism is more individualized than that even, and that racism is not just white over black, or this color over another color. Because he asks in this question, he says, what if racism has been polluting most white people too? Mm-hmm. And I've been thinking to myself, now, wait a second, let me think about that. How have I been polluted by racism? And the next question of that is in what ways have I not benefited from racism? That's a question that's going to make me think about my privilege. Mm-hmm. And also, but then there's another part of that too, and that is all white people do not benefit equally from racism. Who does benefit mostly from racism? Well, I have a lot of privilege, but not like some. Mm-hmm. So it's a matter of identifying where the power lies, and that is a lot by following the money.
Yeah.
So, what your thoughts?
It did remind me that class plays such a significant part of racism, and that unfortunately that can be a unifying factor in racism, both for white people and black people and Latinx people and others. I mean, that is across the board a unifier. And I don't know that Kendi, perhaps this is a critique, because I was struck last week, Sharon in her wonderful academic way talking about how you don't read a book like of this density and agree with everything that the author does. So perhaps it's a critique of Kendi. Maybe that's not something he addresses as in depth as perhaps I need or others might want, is the class aspect of racism. But it is undoubtedly, in my mind, a part of that. And so to me, that's what this part or this aspect of it speaks to, is that there are those who are white, either not as privileged or not as wealthy, who perhaps who are impacted or perhaps not as impacted by racism as others. And I think that's where class plays into this.
Yeah.
And I think it is class, and when I was thinking about it, I was thinking it's easier for me to think about how I've benefited from racism in terms of privilege compared to some other whites. My white siblings who are unemployed, who live paycheck to paycheck, who work in jobs that destroy their health, and whether it's in mines or factories or whatever, that's a class thing. He does, the beginning chapters of the book, he talks a little about class and ethnicity, and then the intersections with sexism and queer racism, I don't want to do it because it would be too painful to even look at, but you could create a hierarchy in terms of where the most power lies and where the least power lies. And last week we talked about, one of the most victimized of the people is the black transgendered woman. And so I agree, I'm not up here, but I'm sure privileged enough that I'm not here either. And it's just true. And I think it's that part of the self-reflection for me, and I think for others, is looking at how much we have benefited in ways we didn't ever think about.
Right.
One part of this chapter that was incredibly heartbreaking to me was how he covered the story of Trayvon Martin, and how it's just almost beyond belief that our system turns away and turns the blind eye to a tragedy like that. Mm-hmm. It's hard to put words to, and it was another part of Kendi's feeling of hatred for racism, and I wouldn't go as far as to say hatred for racists, because in the next part of the chapter he talks about we're people, mm-hmm. and there's hope for change. Racism is horrible, but if we can stop our denial, mm-hmm. If we can admit where we're at, if we can accept the reality of the situation and acknowledge our part in it, and accept the pain of the struggle, then there's hope for people. But it was tremendous. It's, he talked about the pain, experiencing the pain of all of it, and when he came to his illumination, his realizations, he says, "It cleansed my mind, but not my body. It did not address the pain." Yeah. And for me, that meant pain means that there's still work to be done, and that's what we need to accept. So, and I'll just quote him finally in page 227. He says, "I realize there's nothing wrong with racial groups. There's everything wrong with individuals who think there is something wrong with any of the racial groups." Yeah. So, at any rate, it's a great chapter. I think we're ready to move on to.
Yeah, I just want to say, and I appreciate you bringing up the Trayvon Martin, and I just think it has such poignancy for those of us here in Florida. If I'm keeping my dates correct, that was the summer of 2013, I believe. And that happened just shortly before I came here to interview to be the associate minister. And I remember visiting with the search committee about, ideas around things we might study or issues that we might address, this just kind of a general interview question. I just remember commenting like, well, Florida's been impacted by this, and, Trayvon Martin, and, we had a little bit of conversation. But it was, I think the way Kendi writes about it, and it's so interesting how, times and things shift. I think he writes in such a vulnerable way about Trayvon Martin, and in such a skillful way. As I was listening to him, it brought tears to my eyes, because I remember thinking 7 years ago when I had that interview, I spoke about it in a very academic way. Listening to him describe it, and now calling Florida home, it's very different. And so I just had to share that, and I appreciate you bringing that up, because I do think he writes about it in a very poignant way. So I don't know. Just wanted to share that. I don't know if there's other comments that anyone wants to make, but I can take us on to chapter 18, which, kind of like what David was saying, when I saw the chapter title of survival, I thought, oh wow, okay, this is going to be this powerful chapter. And it was powerful, but not in the ways that I expected. And even my mom finished the book, I think yesterday, and was saying on my social media today how she was not prepared for how this would end, how this book would end. So in 18, he uses this powerful image of he and his family's cancer journey, and compares it to our society's fight against racism. So he talks about Sadiqa, his spouse, who is diagnosed with stage 2 breast cancer. And then, if I understood the timeline correctly, shortly after she was finished with her treatments, his mother was diagnosed with stage 1 breast cancer. And then after he gets settled in at American University, he is diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer, which, having done pastoral ministry long enough, you'd never want to hear stage 4, and you never want to hear colon cancer. And so to hear stage 4 colon cancer, I just thought, wow. So on page 235, he describes moving past his denial, both about cancer and about racism, this way, which I thought was really powerful. I have cancer, the most serious stage. Cancer is likely to kill me. I can survive cancer against all odds. My society has racism, the most serious stage. Racism is likely to kill my society. My society can survive racism against all odds. So as I read that, or listened to it and then looked back in the book, what struck me about that is I watched, as we all did, our nation, what felt to me almost tear itself apart in this summer, following George Floyd's death. Can our country survive racism?
Well, I think his assertion and your question are interesting, and my answer depends on how you understand it. So if by saying my society can survive racism, he means we can overcome racism, then I very much want to agree with him.
Yeah.
We can survive this and get past it. Understood in the other way, can our survive racism if racism continues? Mm-hmm. I don't think we can survive.
Yeah. That was kind of my take on it.
I think what you're talking about in terms of being torn apart, the level of just animosity and hurt and anger. I mean, there's so many emotions that either we take this time and do something with it, or we'll do ourselves in. Mm-hmm. I mean, it feels we have to make a difference.
Yeah. So as I read that question, I reinterpreted it to: can we survive self-interest? Can we survive fear? And can we survive indifference on any level in our society? So when it comes to racism, when it comes to inequity, when it comes to climate change, when it comes to any of these forces that could tear society apart and make it unsurvivable. That's the question. But I still think self-interest is at the bottom of it. And can we survive? No, if we are unwilling to examine our self-interest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I hadn't boiled it down to that, and I don't want to say simply because it's not simple, but that directly about self-interest. But I so resonate with that, and I appreciate that, David, because I do wonder, and I do think you've got me thinking about how so much of what we deal with, both with racism and then all the other issues you've raised, I really do think that has a lot to do with it. And I just think about, I was also thinking back, I didn't write it down, but I was thinking back, to the first 2 weeks of the Sacred Conversations when we asked our guest panelists if they see this as a watershed moment. And, and they essentially said, we hope it is, meaning, we hope that people will take this and do something with it. But I just feel like if we were to keep seeing that level of what we saw earlier this summer, I don't see how our culture and society could sustain that. And frankly, the rioting that we still see. And I think about Oregon and Chicago and places now where federal troops are being sent in under very strange circumstances. And so we lift that up as well.
I really appreciate that too, David, and it really fits with the themes in his book in terms of, I hope I'm not overstating his case, but I think he basically says racism is about power and self-interest. Mm-hmm. And so, as well as a lot of other societal ills, and doing that just raises an interesting thought in my mind, because that is a place where I think the Christian church has a message. We have a message that says life is not all about self-interest. Mm-hmm. And, the one who gives her life away is the one who will find it. And I hadn't connected all those dots in the same way, but he certainly says, we tell ourselves it's about this, it's about that. It's not. It's about powerful self-interest.
Well, and I think that's, and again, thank you, because I think that's such a great way to summarize all of the complexities that are raised in this book into a very, what my preaching professor in seminary would say is a portable idea, is that it is about self-interest, and that as a society, that is what the church can offer. The Church Universal, and I hope forever, Naples United Church of Christ, can offer these complex issues, is that it is beyond the self, that it is about beloved community, in the words of Dr. King. And it is, and, so again, not to over polarize an issue, but, that's what has been, I was listening to a podcast this morning about, that's what some of the mask issue is about. It is about, yes, you can protect yourself, but it is also about protecting one's community and in the area in which one has your being. So again, I appreciate both of that. As I mentioned earlier, so one of my modern day heroes died last week, and Congressman John Lewis, we lost at the age of 80 due to cancer. I jumped ahead. I'm going to back up. Excuse me. Well, okay, I'm going to jump ahead for the sake of time. So I'm going to keep going with that thought. Excuse me. So as I've talked about before, I had the privilege of meeting Congressman Lewis when I was a congressional intern. I got to spend time with him, and he always had this great way with words, and it was always fun to get to listen to him speak, because he was known for saying, "Get into good, necessary trouble." And actually, he said that publicly, even very recently in March of this year, when talking about issues of justice. And as we have celebrated his life, we've been reminded of his own good trouble. He had a sit-in on the House floor following the Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando. He was arrested over 40 times, 3 of those while he was a member of Congress. And so I think one of the things that we're challenged to ask ourselves as we face some of these issues, what good and necessary trouble are you willing to get into to address systemic racism in our community and beyond?
Yeah. Referring back to my time with the New Chapters group this morning, we viewed a TED Talk that was presented by a black woman by the name of Dr. Nita Mosby Tyler. She is the founder of the Equity Project. And her talk was about something that each of us are empowered to be is an unlikely ally. So when she told some stories in this talk, but basically what it boils down to is that we all have the power to speak up when we see something happening that is not just. And so she gave examples of that, but she said, what if white people led the charge to end racism instead of black people? What if authors were leading the charge along with Kendi to put pressure on power and teeth into policy change? But she made it very down to earth. It was like, if you see something, say something, because we all have the power to do that. And so that sounds like good necessary trouble to me. If there's somebody in front of me in the grocery line who obviously is being treated unjustly, why shouldn't I say, wait a minute, what's going on here? That's not right. And then that's where it starts. So
Yeah.
And I found myself going back to the early part of tonight about outcomes and thinking, I want to commit to getting into good trouble that will yield results.
Yeah.
So that takes time to figure out. We obviously need to do all the things that we can identify, but if we're talking about making big changes, which certainly John Lewis did, that it's got to be strategic and figure out where we can be successful at making a difference.
Yeah, and that's part of what I'm looking forward to hearing, particularly Vincent Keys next week of our local NAACP, because I know that they have plans and constant strategy around things that need to change locally, because that's how this series of sacred conversations have been designed, is to start universal and go to local. And so I'm grateful to you and to the Justice Committee to talk about that. I think for me, it's about policy-related things, because I know that there have to be things in our local policies that we need to address. But, and then David, kind of back to what you were saying is, I think racist jokes are still told on a pretty consistent basis. And while I can't think of being in that situation recently, but if I am, to say, I'm not okay with those in my presence. And, I think little actions like that can produce noticeable change. And so I think there's little things we can do, and I think there are those large systemic issues. And then lastly, Kendi has this powerful image on page 237 about cancer and racism. Again, he plays this image throughout the whole chapter. And he asked this question: what if we treated racism in the way we treat cancer? What would that look like in our society? And I'm just curious if you had any thoughts about that, because I was just struck by that image by him.
yeah, I appreciate the image in terms of its power, because cancer is a very fearful, sometimes fatal part of our health journey. Right now, do you poison racism, or do you cut it out? What do you do?
Yeah.
I mean, those are the two main treatments for cancer. And he did touch on briefly, and I wish he had gone a little further,
Yeah.
about the whole thing about prevention versus treatment. how do you prevent racism from taking hold? And that, I think, has a lot to do with power and policy making. You know, when people can go to a Board of Christian Education meeting or a condo meeting or any other gathering where policy is being made that could be racist, for somebody to be able to stand up and say, wait a minute, that doesn't sound right to me. You know, I think that's one way to, at least to prevent cancer. But once it's there, now that it's here, ugh,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah,
I'm not a doctor.
not that kind of doctor.
Well, in that, I had the same reaction of, oh my gosh, there are so many different treatments for cancer and so many different cancers, and so I had a hard time playing it all out. But one little piece of it that is not exactly the treating cancer, but he manages, in spite of everything, to have and to insist upon the importance of hope.
Yeah.
And I think in that regard, we know that people with hope survive cancer better than those who don't. And we need hope. And I think in this pandemic, we all know we need hope more than ever. Yeah. And so I really appreciate that, in spite of everything that you can learn from this book about how pervasive racism is and all of its intersections, and how it's 400 years old. I mean, there's so much to learn. And then you learn about his cancer, and so much cancer, but that he still ends with a word of hope, I think was very helpful to me.
Yeah. No, I concur wholeheartedly. Well, I want to thank my colleagues for your participation in these sacred conversations, and certainly want to thank Deb as well, even though she is not able to be with us tonight, is still with family in California. And I want to let you know that there are still copies available in the church office of How to Be an Anti-Racist by Abram X. Kendi. We can arrange to send one to you, or we can also arrange for you a time for you to come by and pick it up. Just feel free to let Chelsea know in the front office. I also want to thank Tony and Brad for their fantastic audiovisual work, as well as Wendy for her behind-the-scenes work. And then I hope you'll join us next week for our concluding week of these sacred conversations as our newly formed Justice Committee looks at the question of what now, by visiting with local leaders and members of our community, as I mentioned, including Vincent Keys, who is president of the Collier County chapter of the NAACP. From there, I want to let you know that the Clergy Roundtable will take a break during August and September, and we will return on Wednesday, October 14th, as we begin a discussion of Forgive to Live, How Forgiveness Can Save Your Life, by Dr. Dick Tibbetts and Steve Halliday. As we close tonight, I want to offer these words of Congressman Lewis as a blessing for us. You are a light. You are the light. Never let anyone, any person, or any force dampen, dim, or diminish your light. Release the need to hate, to harbor division, and the enticement of revenge. Release all bitterness. Hold only love, only peace in your heart, knowing that the battle of good to overcome evil is already won. Thank you again for joining us. Have a good evening, and please stay safe.
I have the pleasure to present to this great audience young John Lewis, National Chairman, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Brother John Lewis.
march today for jobs and freedom. But we have nothing to be proud of. But hundreds and thousands of our brothers are not here. For they're receiving starvation wages or no wages at all. While we stand here, there are sharecroppers in the Delta of Mississippi who are out in the field working for less than $3 a day, 12 hours a day. While we stand here, there are students in jail on trumped-up charges. Our brother James Farmer, along with many others, is also in jail. We come here today with a great sense of misgiving. It is true that we support the administration's civil rights bill. We support it with great reservation, however. Unless Title III is put in this bill, there's nothing to protect the young children and old women who must face police dogs and fire hoses in the South while they engage in peaceful demonstration. In its present form, this bill will not protect the citizen of Danville, Virginia, who must live in constant fear of a police state. It will not protect the hundreds and thousands of people who have been arrested upon Trump charges. What about the 3 young men, Snickfield Secretary in Americus, Georgia, who face the death penalty for engaging in peaceful protest? As it stands now, the voting section of this bill will not help the thousands of black people who want to vote. It will not help the citizens of Mississippi, of Alabama and Georgia, who are qualified to vote but lack a 6th grade education. One man, one vote is the African cry. It is ours too. It must be ours. We must have legislation that will protect the Mississippi sharecropper who is put off of his farm because he dared to register to vote. We need a bill that will provide for the homeless and starving people of this nation. We need a bill that will ensure the equality of a maid who earns $5 a week in the home of a family whose total income is $100,000 a year. We must have a good FEPC bill. My friends, let us not forget that we are involved in a serious social revolution. By and large, American politics is dominated by politicians who build their career on immoral compromise and allow themselves an open form of political, economic, and social exploitation. There are exceptions, of course. We salute those. But what political leader can stand up and say, my party is a party of principles? For the party of Kennedy is also the party of Islam. The party of Jarvis is also the party of Goldwater. Where is our party? Where is the political party that will make it unnecessary to march on Washington? Where is the political party that will make it unnecessary to march in the streets of Birmingham? Where is the political party that will protect the citizens of Albany, Georgia? Do you know that in Albany, Georgia, 9 of our leaders have been indicted, not by the Dixiecrats, but by the federal government for peaceful protest? But what did the federal government do when Albany Deputy Sheriff beat Attorney C.B. King and left him half dead? What did the federal government do when local police officials kicked and assaulted the pregnant wife of Slater King and she lost her baby? Those who have said be patient and wait, we must say that we cannot be patient. We do not want our freedom gradually, but we want to be free now. We are tired. We are tired of being beaten by policemen. We're tired of seeing our people locked up in jail over and over again. And then you holler, be patient. How long can we be patient? We want our freedom and we want it now. We do not want to go to jail, but we will go to jail if this is the price we must pay for love, brotherhood, and true peace. I appeal to all of you to get in this great revolution that is sweeping this nation. get in and stay in the streets of every city, every village and hamlet of this nation until true freedom comes, until the revolution of 1776 is complete. We must get in this revolution and complete the revolution. For in the Delta of Mississippi, in Southwest Georgia, in the Black Belt of Alabama, in Harlem, in Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, and all over this nation, the black mass is on the march for jobs and freedom. They're talking about slow down and stop. We will not stop. All of the forces of Eastland, Barnett, Wallace, and Thurman will not stop this revolution. If we do not get meaningful legislation out of this Congress, the time will come when we will not confine our marching to Washington. We will march through the South, through the streets of Jackson, through the streets of Danville, through the streets of Cambridge, through the streets of Birmingham. But we will march with the spirit of love and with the spirit of dignity that we have shown here today. By the forces of our demand, our determination, and our numbers, we shall splinter the segregated South into 1,000 pieces and put them together in the image of God and democracy. We must say, wake up, America, wake up, for we cannot stop, and we will not and cannot be patient.